Okay, so in this video we're going to keep looking at different groups of pathogenic organisms, and we're going to look at viruses now. You guys have had a particular exposure to viruses in the news recently, hopefully not in person, but everyone is aware of viruses right now. Probably like never before in our history, certainly not with this much capabilities of reaching different people through social media and the news and stuff and so forth. But anyways, most people are going to have a very familiarity with viruses at this point. But viruses are a group of microorganisms that are on the submicroscopic level. So we can't see these unless we have the most powerful of microscopes. And even then, they're not much bigger than molecules really in terms of size. So they're very, very small. And if you look at the picture here, this is kind of showing us in comparison. Keep in mind that this is a bacteria, okay? So we've seen how small they are when we've looked at them on our microscopes. And then you look how much smaller these examples of viruses are. So this is a herpes virus, which is going to give you those herpes sores that you find on your mouth, or you can also find them on your genitals in some cases. This is a chlamydia bacteria, so it's another very small bacteria. This is a sexually transmitted disease. We've got an influenza virus right here, so this is very similar to what we've been dealing with in the news. Pox virus, and then finally the polio virus. And you can see these are less than a micron. We're talking about measuring viruses in nanometers, and nanometers, as hopefully you guys will all know, is measured in 10 to the minus 9 meters. So we're talking about incredibly small semi-organisms, I guess you could say. They're a very unusual group in that they don't have any cellular components, okay? They don't have anything that really we've been discussing in terms of what makes something living, because they're not a living group. They do have nucleic acids. They will have DNA or RNA, depending on the type of virus they are. So we often classify them based on if they're a DNA virus or if they're an RNA virus. They don't have the ability to reproduce, which is why we say that they're not a living organism. Okay, every living organism needs to be able to reproduce in some way, but a virus cannot do that unless they have a host organism. So it makes them an obligate parasite. So they have to be parasitic in order to carry out their life cycle. Now, their general life cycle, their general reproductive pattern is that they need to find their way into a cell. When they do, their genetic material, their DNA or their RNA, that'll hijack the nucleus. Once it hijacks the nucleus, it takes over that cell, it reprograms that cell, and that cell becomes a virus factory. So different parts of the cell will produce virus proteins, they'll reproduce virus DNA, and then the viruses will reassemble and they'll leave the cell, either by killing the cell or by just exocytosis, and then they go out and they find another cell that they can infect. So they're not living, they can only reproduce if they hijack a host cell. And here's a look at some of the different parts of a virus. So we have a protein coat that's on the outside, and then inside of that we have a very itty bitty amount of cytoplasm maybe, but most importantly we have the nucleic acid. And like I said, these are so small that they're on a molecular level, so they're comparable in size to molecules. So if we look at the really highly magnified picture here, you can actually see the chunks, the monomers that make up the protein wall, and you can see bits and pieces of their genes on the nucleotides, on the nucleic acids. So tiny organisms. Now, the virus structure is going to vary depending on the size of the protein coat. And the biggest part of the virus is going to be its protein coat. It's often called a capsid. So we look at the different structure of virus based on its protein coat or its capsid. And then we often name viruses based on the disease they cause or where they were discovered. So if you think of the virus Ebola, that was discovered near the Ebola River in Africa, and that's where it got its name. We're trying to move away from that now. We don't like to do that because we end up assigning a blame almost to a certain area in the world where they just by chance happen to discover this virus. So for example, when the virus SARS-CoV-2 was discovered in Wuhan, China. At first, it was going to be called Wuhan virus, but the World Health Organization decided to call it SARS-CoV-2. So the name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2, and it causes a disease called COVID-19. So name of the virus and the name of the disease kind of related, but different. We don't relate it anymore to where it was discovered. Now, there are some generalizations of viruses, and the most common one is the bacteriophage. And the bacteriophage is in this slide right here. And this is a very common depiction of a virus, when in fact this virus only infects bacteria. So a bacteriophage is a virus that only infects bacteria. So these virus particles will attach themselves to the bacterial cell wall, and it will inject its DNA into the bacterial cell. So the genetic material is protected up here in the capsid, and when the virus attaches itself to a bacterial cell, it will shove the DNA into the cell through the tail. Once that genetic material enters the bacterial cell, it will take over the bacteria's metabolism, and it will cause that bacteria to start making particles for the virus. So it'll start making a new sheath, a new rod, a new capsid. It'll start reproducing the nucleic acids, start making new tails. What will happen when all those things are done is that the cell will be assembled, the virus will be assembled, and then it will be released, and then it can go and attack other bacterial cells. So that's viruses, and like I said, you guys have had a lot of exposure to information about viruses in the news, certainly all this year, all for 2020. If you think back to January when COVID-19 was first discovered, it's been dominating the news ever since. The next group we'll talk about are the fungi, and this is the first group of pathogens that we talked about that are eukaryotic. Okay, so these are the first cells that are pathogenic that have a true nucleus. These cells are going to be much bigger than bacterial cells, way bigger. Remember, it's eukaryotic, so it has a true nucleus, it has true membrane-bound organelles. Fungi cells are quite similar to plant cells in terms of structure. Their cells are quite long, and their cells are actually called hyphae, and they tend to be long and cylindrical almost in shape. They're pretty easy to recognize once you see a few, and they can also be multinucleate, so they can have more than one nucleus or more nuclei per cell. Even though the cells are much bigger than bacteria and they're eukaryotic, they're still quite simple cells. They don't have the ability to photosynthesize. Fungi tend to be what we know as absorptive heterotrophs, which means they secrete enzymes outside of their body. They live on their food, they live on their substrate. The enzymes are secreted onto the substrate. The substrate and the food is broken down, and then the molecules, the nutrients that they need, is absorbed through the body of the fungi. So that's an adaptation to feed without having a digestive system or being able to photosynthesize. Some of the common terms you'll hear when we're talking about fungi are the hyphae, which are the individual cells. The spores. If you come down in the morning and you're going to make some toast and you open up a bag of bread and you notice it's all gone green or it's gone black, what you're actually seeing there is the reproductive structures and the spores of a fungi. The hyphae, the cells, and the mycelium. The mycelium is the group or structure of many cells together. That's all going to be deep into the bread, and right on the surface you're going to see all those spores, and they look green or black or yellow or white even. And that's what's going to make your bread look moldy. But you're actually seeing the spores or the reproductive structures. And fungi can range in size. They can be right down to a single cell like we talk about with yeast. And they can grow up to the giant puffball, which can be more than 45 pounds. So they can be quite big organisms as well. If you get a fungal infection, they're often called mycotic infections. And if you ever decide down the road that you wanted to study fungi, then the science of studying fungi is called mycology. Now, diseases that are associated with fungi are a lot less than bacteria. Okay, bacteria are more diverse in terms of the number and the types of diseases they cause. We've got 2 or 3 really common fungal infections. The first one is by far the most popular one. It's called a species called Candida albicans, and this is very commonly referred to as a yeast infection. Okay, Candida are normal microflora. They'll grow naturally on our skin on everybody. They'll often grow in the mouth. They'll often grow in the gastrointestinal tract, but they very rarely, not very rarely, but they rarely cause disease. Generally, Candida infections will happen in an opportunistic way. So conditions change. For example, maybe the immune system is really low, and then this pathogen, this fungi, can become opportunistic and cause an infection. An example of a Candida infection is often called thrush, and that's where you get growth of the fungi on the surface of the skin. It's quite commonly found in the throat and the esophagus, and I've got some pictures of that, I think, on the next slide. A second really common fungi pathogen is a species called Cryptococcus neoformans, and this is like a single-celled. It's almost like a yeast, except it has a capsule around it. But it's very commonly found associated with bird and bird feces. Okay, so pigeons, we see them around campus all the time. Try and stay away from their feces, because it could contain this, or more than likely will contain this fungi, and it can cause a pretty serious infection called meningitis. Now, you guys know the meninges are the membrane that surrounds the central nervous system. So if you see itis at the end of a word, that's generally medical speak for an infection. So meningitis is an infection of the meninges, which is that membrane that surrounds the central nervous system. And since it's the central nervous system, that's something that we should really be afraid of, because it's the brain and it's the spinal cord. So this Cryptococcus infection, meningitis, will be seen as a secondary infection in an AIDS patient, for example, because AIDS patients have very compromised immune systems. This can become opportunistic and cause meningitis, and it can often be deadly for people who are fighting AIDS. So here's a couple of pictures of some fungi. Here we get the individual cells of the Candida. So it's a single cell, it's a yeast. Now these cells, even though they look quite small, are going to be quite large compared to bacteria. Okay, so much bigger, and they're eukaryotic. Don't forget that. Now here on this second picture here, this is a picture of Candida infection in the gastrointestinal tract. So we're seeing this with an endoscope, which is a camera that goes in a tube that goes down your throat. So this would be an example of thrush. Generally, if we think of thrush, it's in our mouth and our throat. This is probably a little bit deeper down. And then, of course, the lowly pigeon is going to be our vector. It's going to be an organism that can transport a pathogen. In this case, it's going to be the Cryptococcus neoformans yeast or fungi, which can cause meningitis, which is quite a serious infection.